Good morning, good afternoon. Can anybody hear me?
I can. Good
There you
afternoon.
are. Hey, Jay, good afternoon. How are you today?
I'm good, thank you. How are you doing?
Oh, I am pretty great now that I get to talk to you. Thanks so much for your time.
Oh yeah, thanks for having me on.
So, I'm really excited to get to hear how your project came to be, your latest project, Dante's Inferno, an epic, massive adaptation. But I kind of want to start back at the beginning a little bit to get a sense of you and what you're all about. So, do you mind if we get the ball rolling by perhaps you sharing a couple of things about where you're from, where you grew up?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm from North Carolina, a city called Greensboro, and lived there my whole childhood. So we didn't move around or anything, and then moved just slightly east to Raleigh, in North Carolina, for when I was 18 for college, and I've been here ever since then.
Oh,
So I'm here,
wonderful.
still in Raleigh.
So, home is home, and it's always felt like home for you.
Yeah.
Oh, good, good. Did you have a lot of creativity or any writing in your family when you were younger? Was that something that was pretty common for you?
Yeah, well, so my dad's a pretty creative person. So he wrote some he's written some poetry and stuff like that. Like
Oh,
nothing
great.
published, but just as, as fun. So yeah, I would say there's some um but I'm definitely the most, writerly person, I guess you could say.
Yeah. So he passed that on to you in a way. Do you
He did.
recall writing when you were younger? What was the earliest memory that you have of writing or being creative?
Oh, super early. So I used to do these little books about dinosaurs and whales and stuff in
Oh, nice.
kindergarten. And then and I used to read. I loved reading Dr. Seuss and Shel Silverstein,
Mm.
and so I loved reading poetry like of that sort, but never wrote it until I think like in third grade we had an assignment, and I just you know, went crazy writing all sorts of little poems for it, and I've been writing poetry ever since then.
Oh, that's
So
lovely.
yeah.
So you decided to go to study this for school, right? Or did you study something else when you were in, say, later in high school or college?
Yeah, so well, a little bit of both, I guess. 'Cause I double majored in engineering and also in English literature.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I sort of stuck with it while also pursuing other
That is
things.
that is some very real world thinking that I desperately appreciate. I think it's pretty wonderful. What led you to do that? I mean, was it sort of like a life thing where you made an agreement with your parents, or was it something like, "No, I'm gonna be a realist about this"?
There was not that much planning was involved. It was it was it was more like pursue the things that I love, right?
Mm.
And my favorite things were writing stories and poetry, and then physics. I also really love physics.
Oh, interesting.
So that's sort of what my thinking was going into it, was like, well, I can sort of try to pursue both if possible.
Mm. I love that. It's like not taking any what do you call it? No hostages taken or whatever. I don't even know what the expression is. It's a very tired and useless expression, but it's more like no compromise, right? No compromise. I'm gonna go pursue that. So
Yeah.
when did you find this interesting I guess interest in classical works? In particular, you mentioned in this really amazing interview on the Dante podcast. I sat there and listened to that yesterday, and I was like, "This is one of my favorite podcasts already." Like that was a
Oh
hell of
yeah.
an interview with you. You had so many awesome things to say, and I was just really taken with Mark, the interviewer, the podcaster. So, can you tell me when this began for you, where you started honing in on the classics, in particular? Works of Dante and mythology as something that was really kind of striking you.
Yeah, sure. So the classics, it goes way back again. So I think in like, I don't remember what grade, third or fourth grade in elementary school, we started learning about just like Greek gods and goddesses. And I was really into it back then. So I
Mm.
just liked all the little, wild stories and
Yeah.
and everything. In fact, I remember having like a report, like some sort of project that I did where I had to dress up as Zeus and come in front of the class. So
That's epic.
yeah.
How did that
So
go, if you remember?
I have no idea, to be
You're like,
honest.
"This is
I think
me, I did the thing."
right,
Yeah.
right. I think it went well, I guess, right?
Yeah.
As well as that can go.
No, I love that. I kind of fixate on those ideas, especially early on, and how, at least for me, they kinda seem to be a North Star for what I wanna do in my life, because I feel like when you get older, it's harder, right, to maintain that interest, that drive for something that is so openly creative without any real excuse. It's just like, this is existing to be like a beautiful, powerful, creative thing. So I'm always kind of interested in how you originated that kind of drive for your work. But now looking back and seeing the work that you're doing now, can you tell me how you settled on Inferno of all works, and how you felt like this could be a good vehicle for what you had to say?
Yeah, so it was, a stroke of luck as much as anything. So in college, I was doing like a world literature class, and I had a great professor, and we came to the time of doing a final essay, and we read Inferno, or at least just a few cantos of it, as part of the class, and I really loved it because of that. Because of my background with Greek mythology. I mean, background, because of my passion for that,
Yeah.
and so I just thought it was so interesting. I knew very little about it, and so I asked my professor if I could do just like a translation of the first canto
Mm.
as instead of a final paper, and he agreed, fortunately, so that was cool. And I ended up doing 5 of them before
Wow.
the assignment was due. They weren't very good. But it was really fun to do,
Mm.
and I think my naivety about it, helped me probably get sucked into it even more because I
Mhm.
didn't know what I was getting myself into.
Yeah.
So that was over 10 years ago now, so that I started all this
Oh,
mess.
wow. So this
Yeah,
has been in the works for about 10 years of you kinda chipping away. Um,
that's right.
that's fascinating. So this seems like something that you had to step away from for some time and then come back to it, and that sort of thing?
Yeah, just, I have lots of I mean, as anybody does, I have lots of other things going on in my life, so in the interim there, so between when I started and now, I guess I started and finished a PhD program
Oh, wow.
in materials engineering, so, like, that was completely different,
Oh,
so that
goodness.
was big chunk of my time there. I, met my now wife, and we fell in love.
Oh,
We had a
wonderful.
son we had a son, got married, so
Oh,
there were lots
goodness.
of other things going on.
Yeah, yeah, and it's fascinating. I'm really struck by how it almost seems like you have these 2 areas of your mind that are a very linear kind of engineer-like way of thinking, and perhaps a very creative kind of approach to life. But do you think that the translations allow you to blend those things, or is there no overlap in your worlds?
I'd say a little bit they blend, yeah, because translation is in some ways I mean, in some ways it's this creative act, because you have to write well and you have to try to that takes creativity. But in another way, it's a puzzle.
Mm.
You're mapping one way of expressing something to another way of expressing something. So
Mhm.
I think in that sense it carries over. And then in like a less direct sense for Dante in particular, because he was super interested in the natural world and
Mhm.
what passed for science in his day. um, just having that background and curiosity about the natural world, I think, also helps me understand and
Mm.
appreciate a lot of what Dante goes for.
Yeah. You had mentioned in the other interview that, you would have been afraid of of Dante at the time if you
Yeah,
ever met him, and I'm curious if you could elaborate on that. I love that.
sure. Um, well, like, okay, so I guess the young Dante, when he lived in Florence, was kind of this, he was a lot happier and freer, and he wrote about um, not easier things necessarily, but like he did. Okay, as an example, he had this friend Forese Donati, and they wrote these poems together, these sonnets that were like basically little rap battles against each other.
Mm.
So like Forese wrote one to Dante that was like making fun of his father or something, right? And then
Yeah.
Dante responds making fun of Forese for gluttony for or whatever, you know. So like
The
that Dante, you know, is more approachable, I feel like, right? The
Mm,
young Dante. By the time he's like finished the comedy, he's this like it seems like a lot more of an austere person, and he's really
mhm.
set in his convictions and things like that, which isn't necessarily like you know because of that you'd think the comedy might be preachy or whatever, but it's
Yeah.
not at all. It's really
Mhm.
about making you think and making you decide for yourself. But he just seems much more intimidating, and he
Mm,
knows everything. I mean, everything there was to know back at that time period, he pretty much knew.
mm.
So I think it would be very intimidating to speak to him.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's fascinating because you do think of the impact of having a life lived in that time period, and just for my own education, were there any major events that disrupted his way of thinking that you could kind of see? I mean, I'm not sure how much information there is on the life of the individual himself, but if there was something that affected the way that he saw the world from a younger person to like what he was later, or was it just getting old?
Well, the I
Which happens,
mean,
it's happening to
suppose
me.
that plays a role, yeah. I mean, so the single biggest thing in his life, there were 2 things that basically happened. One thing that affected him profoundly is he fell in love with this girl, at the age of 9, really or 8, I guess,
Mm,
really early on. Um, because of the way things worked back then, there were arranged marriages and things like that, so it
mm,
was never, like, destined to become anything more than sort of this distant love for her, and he liked to go see her in town and stuff. He lived in Florence, and, when she was young, she was 24, I believe, she died suddenly,
oh,
and so that
damn.
profoundly impacted him, and, in fact, his first little book of poetry is basically centered around her and tells the story of their meeting and how he used to write things for her, and then after she died, how everything sort of shifted. Um, then, not too long after that, so in the year 1301 or end of 1301, beginning of 1302, he was exiled from
Mhm.
Florence. So there was a lot of political tensions in that city. Not unlike what's going on in the United States today.
Sure, sure.
um, they had things that you think of as medieval times, right? Like storming government buildings and things like like that.
Yeah.
So
Sure, that
so
happened a bit more often than it does now, yeah.
right. So anyway, so the basically the opposing party who had the favor of the Pope ended up taking over Florence. And while he was down in Rome trying to speak to the Pope and sort of help fix things, um, they took over the city and they exiled him along with a lot of other political leaders. So he was a
Mm,
political leader as well as a poet.
mhm,
And that, in addition to the death of Beatrice, that was like the single biggest thing that changed him.
mm, yeah.
And shortly after that, he started writing the Inferno.
Wow.
And
And
so,
yeah, that makes perfect sense because I can imagine, right? You have an emotional part of you that's just completely demolished by cruelty of the cosmos or something like that. And then you also have the community that you're supposed to be trying to build or help with turn its back on you. That can kind of make you question just about everything in
yeah,
life. So
yeah.
uh it's a very curious thing because you think that there can be an uncoupling of the religious aspects of the work to look at it more like here's a non-religious way of looking at the world or here's something that kind of reinforces your values or makes you question your values. Do you see that kind of meaning in modern times for this work, for this translation?
Yeah, I mean, so that's a really good question. I think that I don't think the religion can necessarily be decoupled from it. I wouldn't say that. But I would say that anybody can appreciate the poem regardless of their religion.
Mm,
I think I think the things it speaks to are, relevant to everybody. and especially in Inferno and Purgatory, and then it gets more theological in Paradise. It gets
Mhm,
more difficult to sort of follow if you don't study, Thomas Aquinas and so on.
mhm,
But but I think that the things you get out of it are mostly human things, and what does it mean to be a good person, and uh, what does it mean to write good poetry,
yeah,
things like this. So yeah, I think there's a little bit of both,
yeah,
and I think for to translate it, it definitely helps to try to understand the religious implications and the religious background Dante had and stuff like that. To enjoy it as a reader, I think you could get by without it, but
mhm.
you'll understand it more deeply if you make an effort to follow that as well.
Yeah. It's almost one of those things where if you meet it halfway, it will be the gift that keeps on giving, right? It just continues to provide additional pieces of insight or information about, the kind of person that maybe like has that room for introspection, you know?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. Meet it halfway is a good way to describe it too,
yeah,
and that's kind of my approach to literature anyway. In
mm,
general, like
yeah,
you know, nothing is out of its time and place, and meeting it halfway helps you appreciate
yeah.
it better. I think
I love that. Do you feel like you were a good student back in the day when you were going to school?
I was a
Yeah,
pretty good student.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, it just, it strikes me that you probably had to balance a lot while you were doing that. When did you feel like maybe you had bit off more than you could chew? Because you mentioned that you kind of got into the translating project sort of, as a playful thing or something, out of curiosity more like, but when you were starting to get into it a little bit further, maybe you had invested some time into it already. When did you feel like, "Oh, shit, maybe I've gone a little bit too far into this, or maybe I should be doing something else." Did you ever feel that way?
Well, often, yeah, sure. I felt the same way about other things too, like my PhD. I like almost every other day I'd be like, "Oh, well, I just need to drop out of this program. What am I doing here?" And then I'm like, "Well, I've come too far now. I'm not gonna, what is that? The
Yeah,
fallacy of I can't remember the fallacy, right? But it's one
sure.
of those things.
Like a point of no
Um,
return then?
you're right. Yeah, point of no return. Um, the line of Macbeth is "In blood stepped in so far
Mhm.
to return where it's tedious as go o'er." So, um,
Yeah.
so yeah, I mean, I think one of the big points was when I finished the first draft of the translation of the whole Inferno, and then like looked back, comparing the original first few cantos to like my last few cantos, and
Mhm.
just seeing like how completely different they were,
Mm.
and realizing that I really need to rewrite almost everything.
Oh my god. Yeah,
So that
and
was kind of one of those moments.
how much time had you spent at that point?
Oh, I'm not sure. I could figure it out, but it would be years,
Oh my
I
god.
I could figure it out by like my save files, right? But
Yeah. Oh, good lord. Yeah, that's just sounds like such a Herculean task. I mean, there's just so much there. Now, how does this balance out with your life? Having a kid is always a priority, right? As well as
yeah.
family life and things like that. Have you found something that works for you or that worked for you while you were working on this project in terms of any sense of balance, if there was any to be had?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a constant balancing act. Like you said, I mean, family is top priority. So if if I need to spend time doing something family related, I do that instead. Um, doing a PhD for a living basically was helpful in some ways. Um, you don't get a lot of money from a PhD, but what you do have is you have some autonomy over your schedule and stuff like that.
I see.
So that helped in some ways. Um, and then when I finished, my wife was finishing up nursing school at the same time,
Oh, wow.
and so she actually took off some time to stay at home with our son, and write when I could and that type of thing.
I
And so
see.
that was very helpful too.
Yeah. And I can imagine your job takes a lot out of you as well. Is it an engineering? kind of job or position that you currently hold?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
It's like a postdoctoral, research position
Oh, I see. Okay.
in materials engineering, and so yeah, like I kind of have to stop and shift gears. Like I'm slow, okay?
Mhm.
So uh yeah, so sometimes if I'm, been working all day and then come home, spend time with my family, like that's it. That's all I can really muster up. So that's fine.
Oh my
I'm done
god.
with the translation now, so I can take a little break.
You can
So
rest again. Oh my
yeah,
god. And so, like, you've bounced back to other translations, like you did the poems of, Pablo Neruda, and you also worked on your own novel, and I'm really, really curious about your novel, if we could go there for just a moment, because I know that this was an adaptation
yeah,
of one of Sophocles' plays, and, as a theater kid, that was one of my favorite areas, the Greek tragedies of the time, and I'm curious what drew you to the play Philoctetes, and how you made it your own, or how you created something that could have one foot in that realm, but also in the present time and with a bit of your flair and voice.
yeah. So when I read that play in particular, the way I saw the story, I was like, man, this could be almost like a modern sci-fi action movie or something, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot more introspection than most action movies, but the plot at least is, there's like a bow and arrow. Oh, hey bud. So my son just walked in.
That's all good. I gotta tell you, that is, my favorite part of interviews. Like, that would have been my kid, a couple of years back. My kid's 9, so, I usually tell him, when, my wife's not around or whatever, it's like, "Alright, dude, you gotta help me out. You gotta just sit there for a sec and do your thing," and it still cracks me up. I just love it, it's either
Yeah.
kids or cats, and it makes my day.
Oh, yeah, they definitely are.
Uh,
And like I locked this door too. He knows how to unlock
yeah.
doors.
No, my kid did that, like, he's got his little fingernail, I don't even know how he does it, but, they find a way. They
Yeah.
they always do, but
He finds coins. Those are his keys, and he'll get
ah,
in with those.
sneaky. Oh, but that's the life, and I'm
Oh
sorry, I
yeah.
you go ahead.
Oh yeah. So well, that's the work life balance we were talking about. So
Yeah.
that actually fits in nicely. Um, so yeah. So Philoctetes, right? So I read that story, that tragedy, and I just love the story. There's this bow that never misses, right? That's
Mhm.
kind of like an action movie element
Yeah.
or sci-fi movie element. And there's a big war going on between the major powers of the world at the time. So a lot of interesting things going on. And I thought like this would be really cool as a sci-fi story set in
Mhm.
modern times. And so that's kind of what I set out to do. And I didn't set out to write a novel. I was going to do like a short story. And then I was kind of following the text in a way, like trying to include dialogue from Sophocles, but like make it my own,
Mm.
and then also adding lots of other things that aren't in the original play.
Mhm.
So that was basically the idea, and that was another thing where it kind of got out of hand. I was like, well, this is I have like 40 pages. It's not like anywhere near wrapping up. Let's
Yeah.
make it not a short story anymore.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, that's kind of where that comes from. And so it starts with more like almost like genre fiction and then proceeds into the tragedy of
Mhm. Mm.
Sophocles tragedy. So yeah, that was really really fun to do, and that was I guess another project that broke up my translation of Dante too.
Yeah. How long ago was that you worked on the novel?
Oh, that was when was it published? Maybe 2012. So it would have
Oh,
been
okay.
yeah,
I see.
just before that point.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Do you feel like you write pretty fast when you get in a groove, or when you feel like you have, those aims set?
not really. So I'm pretty slow in almost everything that I do.
Same.
but but I definitely do get in grooves. But what I like to do while I'm writing is I constantly reread. So I'm
Mhm.
like I write a little bit, I go back and I reread and see
Yeah.
how it flows into things, you know.
Yeah.
So that makes it very slow. It does make editing easier because I'm more happy with the final product,
Yeah.
even though, you know, even though like I said, like when I got to the end of Inferno, I was like, oh, let's change this whole thing. but
Right.
but yeah, so it's a slow process, but it works for me.
Yeah. So, given how with the translation when you're doing Inferno, there seems to be a huge preoccupation with form. I mean, you're working in a very specific type of verse and, compared to when you're working on a manuscript or something like that, do you feel like, and again, these are very specific to you, working on a manuscript that is based on something that has such a specific form too, that is still more of an original work too, do you take that into consideration, looking at the structures of these Greek plays in any form, or does that not influence you once you look at the source material for the story that it is?
If I were to, let's say, translate a Greek play, form would be very important, and I would want to try to mimic the form.
Mm,
Um, for the novel, it was not so important. It was more to get the story, and then to try to, use some of the dialogue that I liked.
mm,
Um, so I do kind of embed little bits of form. Like sometimes if you read maybe parts of a paragraph, it'll kind of sound like it's in an iambic pentameter and maybe there's a rhyme
mhm,
scheme. That's because there is.
mhm.
But it's not like I'm trying not to draw attention to it. You know what I mean? Like it's
Yeah,
not like
yeah,
set off, you know.
right.
So, and it's not the form of the original. So,
Yeah, yeah,
that's just sort of my own thing. For Dante, for like a direct translation, I think the form is one of the most fun parts. Is trying to mimic the form of the original.
mm,
You know, so
yeah,
I do try
yeah,
to mimic that for direct translation.
yeah. What makes a poor translation of Dante's Inferno? Like, what were some things that you just realize are not, accurately representing the work?
Okay, so I'm definitely not gonna like name any
Oh,
translators
for
or
sure,
anything.
for sure.
Um,
Just personal preferences, I should say.
right, personal preferences. So like, okay, so given that it's a rhymed translation, one of the most important things for me was that it still sound natural and not stilted or like weird syntax and things like that.
Mm,
So that was super important. And my issue with some of the rhyming translations that already exist was that like just doesn't sound like good English necessarily, right? Um, and that's again like not naming names. There are some that are out there that are fantastic. So,
mm,
um, and then the other thing is, so this one's much more subtle. So Dante goes between all sorts of different like registers of speaking. So he has parts that are really crass, low humor, and crude stuff that the devils are doing, and the language is rough.
mm,
And then he'll go up and he'll talk about Ulysses, and have this really bold, epic sounding language,
mhm,
right? So one of the things that needs to be avoided like the most if somebody else let's say somebody else wants to go translate Dante, uh is to try not to make it sound flat. Like
mm,
there are so many different uh moods and feelings throughout the poem, and it's comes across directly in the writing style.
mm,
So that's really hard to replicate, and I think that's the biggest issue. My biggest issue with some of the translations, even good ones, it doesn't capture the emotion as much through the
mm,
style.
mhm. No, that's wonderful. So dealing with foreign languages and things like that, are there languages that you feel comfortable in that, you were able to take from source material? Because you mentioned you worked with the Neruda poems in Spanish or, looking at, the text from Inferno. Are there languages that you feel more acclimated to?
Mostly English, so
Mostly English. Okay.
unfortunately. So yeah, I mean, I took quite a bit of Spanish in classes in high school and
Mm,
college, but like I can't speak it. I
mhm,
can't carry a conversation in Spanish. I'd love to be able to, but I never had practice
mhm,
conversationally, right?
Mm,
So I can like I more or less can read it. I understand like the grammatical structure, but I don't know all of the words necessarily, right? So you
mhm.
have to have assistance, like if I'm translating Neruda.
Sure, sure.
Um, and same with Dante. Like over time, I started not knowing Italian when I started, but I know it pretty well now. I can read it,
Oh, awesome.
can't speak it. I still need some assistance here and
Mhm.
there, you know. So
Yeah. But it's exciting because, like, you look at the text, and I'm sure that you're referencing. I mean, I can't even imagine the amount of research that went into this, and I love that you just sort of became a scholar by just sheer passion, I don't wanna say without academic rigor, but there is your own rigor of study and dedication to it. So I'm curious how that experience has been for you, just acquiring this much information on something that you love.
yeah, I mean, well, fortunately, I like doing that type of thing, so that's
Mhm,
a benefit. But it's a whole lot of work, and it's good. Like probably the bulk of the work is less in writing and more in study. You
mhm.
know,
Yeah,
because trying to understand where Dante's coming from, what tricky passages mean,
yeah.
like what he's referring to and why, those types of questions.
Mhm,
Um, so it's been really interesting, and I'm very fortunate to be living in the time period that I do because we
mhm.
have tons of easy to access resources
Yeah, yeah.
online, and there's been thousands of scholars of Dante over the years that now I can sort of benefit from their labor.
Mhm,
So like as an example, when I'm translating I have the Italian text in front of me, and then I also have 3 other translations in front of me, and then I make this sort of weird, like, pidgin language version, that only makes sense to me, like, it kinda looks
mm,
like code on the screen.
yeah.
I make that first, and then I go through, and as I'm going through that, I'm also reading commentaries on the poem, so,
Oh,
like, the
great.
the big one is, Charles Singleton's commentary, and then there's other people that, have great commentaries as well.
Mm,
But, so I'm kinda doing all of that as I go through very slowly, and then I go through and do the version in verse.
mm,
So, yeah, so like I said, it's slow, but it's nice because it's kinda like a really close reading of the poem.
and that's lovely to hear, especially now that it is live and ready to go, it's published. That has to be an incredibly rewarding feeling. What was the publication path for this project?
Yeah, so, I mean, I debated back and forth about which ways to pursue, and I ended up deciding to do independent publishing. Part of that decision is because I did that for Neruda, and it worked out very well.
Mm,
That's been, like, pretty successful.
mm,
Um, and it's nice because you get to sort of control everything.
yeah.
Uh, there's obvious downsides because, like, your book's probably not gonna appear in, big stores, that type of thing. Like,
Mhm,
the only way people can really get it are online or if bookstores happen to place an order
mhm,
for it. So there's downsides, and some people, like some outlets will kind of ignore you if you don't have, like, a big name publisher or whatever.
mhm.
So that's fine. I kinda knew that getting into it, but I thought this was a good way to go, to be able to sort of get out the book that I wanted to get out.
Yeah. What are some takeaways or learning experiences from that process that you feel have been pivotal or that you wanna take to the next project?
Um, so yeah, so a lot of the things I learned from doing the Naruto book first. Um, in that book, I like didn't purchase my own ISBN numbers, and so like it shows up as independently published, right?
Mm.
So those are like there's lots of little small things. Like I didn't contact enough reviewers. I definitely didn't get on any podcasts. So
Well, come back anytime.
hey, happy to.
Door's always open.
so I think those taught me lessons like what I should do for Inferno. And I think it ended up being a more professional product, even though I'm still very happy with the Neruda translation as well.
Mhm.
Um, I mean, this looks, the Inferno translation is very great. It's exactly the way I want it. I'm not going to change any of it, right? Like the Naruto book, I might come up with a second edition, So
Mhm.
So those are some of the takeaways, and just like yeah, there's a lot of hard work that goes into it, like marketing and stuff like that. I've just
Mhm.
been sending emails to anybody that might be possibly interested in it, and
Yeah,
might or like bloggers who do book reviews and all sorts of stuff.
right.
So trying to get all that down in my head. I'm not very good at it.
No, but it's amazing because you do show that determination, right? And I think most of us just kinda look at the look at the mountaintop from the very base, and then we go, "Ah, hell, that's not worth it," you know? I'd just rather let it languish in, in my own purgatory or whatever, but it's admirable because I do think that we can empower writers a lot more, and, having that example is definitely very optimistic, especially in your lane, right? In the area of sharing these classic works to a newer generation. And, that's one of my last questions. And I only got a couple more because I want to respect your time. But before I come back to that big question, I want to ask you what you have on the horizon. It seems like you have more translations and other projects, and I'm curious to know what else is coming up.
Yeah, sure. So there's three things I kind of have going on, at least in my head so far, right? So, well, two of them are in progress. So one is a translation of the Iliad
Mm,
in in dactylic hexameter.
wow.
Um, so basically, there's a poem by Longfellow called Evangeline, and it has sort of the meter that I'm going for, but less try to be less archaic in my language.
Mm,
Um, so there's that. I have some of the first book, like it's very, very much um in the beginning stages of that. So that's one. Another is another book of Dante's, the Vita Nuova, which
mm.
is the book that I mentioned that he wrote while still in Florence about Beatrice.
Oh, yeah.
And it's a short book. So I thought it was sort of a no-brainer to translate it, and it would be fun. It would be a nice way to stick with Dante without moving on right away to Purgatory. So, um, and I'd say I'm about halfway through that, and and then of course the next big project for Dante is to move on and do Purgatory.
Mhm.
So I have
Yeah.
not started that yet, but I'm waiting for the opportune time.
You deserve a little break, it seems like, yeah, you gotta take a little bit of time for just about everything else, but 2 more questions, before I leave you be. I'm curious, because we've been focusing on the classics, what are some contemporary works, whether be they books, music, or movies, TV shows, whatever, that are inspiring you or making you feel like you're getting your creative vibe going again?
Sure. Man, that's hard to answer because I like a lot of variety of things.
Oh, video games too. I
Oh,
welcome video
video
games.
games too. Yeah, absolutely. So I like all of these things. All right. So so I'm a big gamer. Right now, yeah, well, I'm not playing it. I've been done with it for a long time, but my favorite game right now is Breath of the Wild.
Breath
Great
of the
game.
Wild? What is that?
It's a Legend of Zelda game.
Oh, okay.
So that's just really fun. It's imaginative. It's a huge, expansive world, and there's details in every little corner of the world. So that's
Mhm.
very cool. Um, and then if there's like story-oriented games, there's this weird little game called the Stanley Parable, where oh man, it's hard to even describe that game. You almost just have to play it. Like you play it and you start and you're like, "Oh, this is kind of a weird game." You're just like walking through this office
Mm,
and there's a narrator and you eventually come to this spot where there's two doors and you can go through either door.
mm.
And like basically whatever happens, you go through one of the doors and then you end up like dying or something happens and it finishes and then you find yourself back at the beginning and
Whoa.
you have to go back through and make different choices, but it like kind of remembers what you've been doing and the choices you've been making, and the narrator is like speaking to you and kind of like making jokes and stuff like that. So that's another good one.
That's
They
awesome.
just yeah. So that's some things. Let's see for books. Man, what have I? I don't even know what I've been reading like all Dante recently, so it's like I'm like, oh, this thing about Dante and this other thing about that.
Yeah. Tough to get out of the mindset when you're working.
Right. There is a great book about Dante called Dante's Bones, which is
Uh,
about what happened to basically his remains after his death,
oh,
and it also goes into his life and stuff, but full of super interesting stories. So that's a
oh, I
good
love
one.
that.
But
I'll have to check that one out.
yeah, and then I like reading I like reading formal poetry, and there's this one that I read to my son. I guess this was actually a couple years ago now, or no, I guess 1 year ago. But it's called the Battle of the Frogs and Mice, and it's a translation.
Mm.
And it's basically like this. It's an ancient poem, and whoever wrote it like in the style of the Iliad, but it's about these frogs and mice, and they're like battling each other,
Oh, that's awesome.
and that's
That's
super
great.
fun.
Yeah.
That's the translator is A.E. Stallings. She has a rhyming verse translation. It's really good. So um that's like these are things that are non-Dante related I'm trying to think of.
No, but those are great because it just goes to show, especially, children's books in the last, you know, recent 8 or 9 years of my life. That's a majority of the stuff that I've been reading because of my kid, so
Yeah,
I always appreciate those.
absolutely. Yeah, me
Yeah.
too.
So
um,
lastly, I'm very curious about this. What kind of lessons and takeaways can we learn from the classics? Because we tend to think of them as these antiquated old ways of telling stories and living, but what is it that you would like to share about the importance of these works for our modern times?
yeah, I mean it's hard to answer in general terms, I think, because I think when you delve into specifics, it's easier to see like, wow, this is very powerful, or this applies here or there. I think partly, so part of it is what we were talking about earlier, like meeting a work halfway. So to get something out of it, if you approach it as if it came out, yesterday in the bookstore and you just bought it, you're gonna find a lot of things you don't like. You're gonna be like, wow, these people are really misogynistic, and they have slaves and all sorts of horrible things. Like this is not a good book. But if you approach it halfway and understand that they're writing from their world, they're also writing really deeply about the human mind and about interactions between people. And there's just a lot to say about how people work, how emotions work, and and also a lot to say. There's a lot to be said about how poetic form, connects to those things.
Hmm.
And I think the classics, the people that are still read today were masters of that, and that's worth trying to replicate today. Um, I also really love narrative poetry, like long narrative poetry, and I
Mm,
wish that there was more of that around today. Like,
mm,
so that's one of my favorite things about the classics is like you can read these really intricate poems, and they're great as poetry, but they're also long stories that are really good as stories.
mm,
They have themes that come back around later in the story and things like
mhm.
that, right? So, um, and of course, like Dante is the top of all of that. Like, I I don't agree with all of Dante's politics. He'd be crazy too, you know. I don't agree with his all of his views on social things. You'd kind of be crazy to do that too. But I mean, he lived in 1300, so um, but um, but he has a lot to say about the modern world because he has a lot to say about people and how people work and how moral questions work. How we can think about things. Like nothing is you'd think that if it's this Christian work that it would be black and white, like these people are in hell, they're all evil. That's not true. Like there's nuances and there's shades of gray, and you know you have to really think hard. Like, why is this person in hell? They seem like a good person, Would I put them in hell? Dante obviously did,
Yeah,
so you have
yeah.
to think hard about these things. Um, like as an example, like a sin that Dante condemns is suicide, and your opinion could be one way or the other on that, but that's the sin that he condemns, and yet there's two characters in the poem that both died, at least two that I know of, that both died by committing suicide, and they're in different places.
Mm,
They're not being condemned for suicide. In fact, one of them, Cato, is saved. He's in purgatory. So it just makes you think, like,
yeah.
why? Why did Dante do that? And you have to
Mhm,
sit down and think about these things. So I think that's the power of classics in general is they're not easy, and you have to think hard, and it makes you think about your own values.
mm,
And you don't have to agree with the values of the classics to do that.
mm.
So yeah.
Oh, I love that, Jay. Thank you so much for all of these amazing answers that you've given us today. And I want to thank you for your work. I mean, I'm really excited to check out your translation. I think it's going to be wonderful, and it's going to show the love that you've put into this work and passion. It's almost a life's work. So I'm very very excited to get to know more about you through your work, and especially check out your novel too, because that really kind of I'm really excited to check that one out too. I think it's going to be
That
awesome.
that makes me very excited because I think
Yeah.
I've sold like 10 copies of that novel, so
Well,
I'm
let that be
super excited.
11. Let that be 11. And I'll tell everyone, all I know is theater people, so we like that sort of stuff.
Yeah. No,
But
it's good. It's good. I just did no promotion at all. So
hey, well, there's always time. But I want to thank you so much for taking the time to do this and for, sharing some thoughts with me. But I hope we can meet again. When the next one comes along, feel free to stop by and say hi, and I'll be here for you. But
definitely, definitely. And thanks for having me on. I was like really glad I discovered this podcast. I've been listening to episodes now,
oh,
so
thanks, man.
now I'm on it, so I'm happy.
No, I really appreciate it. But anytime, man, I will be here, and it's just such a pleasure. And I wish you and your craft, your writing, the best. Your translating, and of course, family. I wish you all very very well.
Thank you so much.
All right, man. Let's be in touch, okay? We'll talk
All
to you
right,
soon.
bye. That sounds
Bye.
good.